Hello, I'm Dean Irvin, and in this episode of Asia's Developing Future, we're exploring how aging is reshaping the region's economies. Joining me today to discuss Asia's demographic dividends and demographic pitfalls are Rohini Somanathan, Professor and Head of the Economics Department at the Delhi School of Economics, and Sagiri Kitao, Senior Research Economist at ADBI. Welcome both of you to the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rohini, if I could start with you. Today, some economies in Asia are aging rapidly, while others remain young. How does this affect the overall economic outlook of the region?
It's a very interesting moment, Dean, because many of the imbalances that we saw in resource allocations and factor endowments across countries were really, the East versus the West. And now you see that within Asia. I think the possibilities for trade based on comparative advantage that existed between North America and Europe on the one hand and Asia on the other now really exist within Asia. And if we can capitalize on those, I think it's really signals a very bright future for this region.
We can maybe talk a little bit more about those opportunities later. Sagiri, Japan is sometimes described as the world's demographic frontier because of its aging population and declining birth rate. From your research, what are the lessons or insights you've found from Japan on maintaining economic growth?
Thank you for asking about Japan. So let me point to two things. First, aging is manageable, but we have to realize that it affects essentially all parts of the economy, ranging from the shortage of workers in the labor market, the need to provide good support in the infrastructure, to keep the fertility rates from falling too much, and also to support a rising number of the elderly who need care services. And of course, there's an increase in the government expenditures. So the demographic aging is a multidimensional challenge and requires really the coordinated reforms across multiple areas. And secondly, aging is largely predictable, but the policy adjustment is often too slow, especially in Japan. And for example, Japan had a clear demographic signals for decades since 1970s, but the major reforms, especially those on the public pension and the health insurance, and those on the labor markets have been implemented only gradually, often, only under fiscal pressure. So the lesson is that the early preemptive reforms are important and far less costly than the delayed and the reactive policy responses.
On the other side of this is that many economies in South and Southeast Asia still have young and growing populations. Rohini, you mentioned just before the opportunities that might be there for these economies. What needs to happen to actually capture their so-called demographic dividend?
Yes, the greatest opportunity is young people and a lot of women out of the labor force. And so if we can get these women into the labor force, that's a way of really contributing to the economy and contributing to gender equality at the same time. The other challenge is really to get young people productively employed. And for that, I think the biggest thing we need to do is really improve basic schooling and really make it a right, high quality public schooling a right. And I think that hasn't happened in India to the extent it should have. There's been a lot of emphasis on higher education. There's a lot of research now that indicates that you have to catch kids really young. And it's these early childhood interventions that matter. So I think what we can do is really focus on nutrition, on mass, high quality education, and basic skills. And then really, think about norms and other childcare, other social services that will help women get out into the labor force. The emphasis in China on local economies and really building town and village enterprises, getting people to work close to home, is something that we could really draw upon. Because in societies that are driven by strong social norms, you're not going to overnight say that women don't have to support the household, they don't have to bring up the kids, they don't have to cook the dinner. It's not going to happen. I mean, that kind of shared responsibility in the house is really a long way away. And so meanwhile, if you have things that they can do close to home, then they're going to be a lot more able to mix work and home.
Is there something about labor mobility in the region as well that policymakers probably have to grapple with? Have you seen anything in that area that encourages or feels encouraging to you?
Yeah, there has been a huge increase in the number of foreign workers in Japan. So especially in the areas like healthcare and the long-term care services. But whether we can continue to count on them is very, doubtful, I think, because those foreign workers, they are facing a much, higher wage growth in their home country, and all the Asian countries, including Korea, China, and perhaps Taiwan, Vietnam, they're going to compete over those workers. So, I mean, the labor mobility is across region quite important, but it's not something that we can count on going forward, I think.
So I think there's a lot of misconception on who's taking whose job, and so we think of a lot of labor market phenomena as zero sum when they're really not zero sum. So you could be just producing more, and yet the impression often seems to be that if someone's coming in, then they must be taking away someone's work. And that can happen. It's not that that's not true, that there isn't possibly a pressure on wages. But I think one needs to think through that much more carefully. Maybe it's not, general openness, but maybe one can think about particular sectors where one can really use, the advantages of particular skills. And Indians would benefit, I think, from going abroad, and other people would benefit from coming in. But we haven't really thought through that very much.
Mm-hmm. Another aspect perhaps that's putting pressure on jobs is automation and digitalization and things like AI. They could be seen as offsetting shrinking workforces in aging societies, but at the same time, they can even reshape job opportunities in some of the younger economies. How do you both see technology interacting with these different demographic changes?
In aging society, technology certainly helps alleviate labor scarcity, but I think there are some limits. Japan is a good example. So firms, Japan is known that firms have invested very heavily in robotics and labor-saving technologies, especially in manufacturing and increasingly in services as well. For example, logistics, retail, and elder care support. But many tasks, particularly in the healthcare, long-term care, or personal services, are very difficult to automate, and that the labor shortages persist in exactly the sectors that are expanding with the demographic aging. So it means that the technology can complement workers, but rarely fully replace them. So I think technology must be combined with the policies that also expand the labor supply, again, such as increasing the female and old worker participation, and improving working conditions in maybe care sectors, and where appropriate, facilitating immigration, as we discussed.
Yeah, I think that the debates on technology and displacement of labor are very old in development economics. So, after the Second World War, it was mechanization and what that's going to do to labor opportunities. And then in the 90s, it was computerization and what that's going to do. And now, of course, it's the big AI moment, and people are thinking, what that's going to do. And overall, I think what's happened is that if a technology is really has the real potential to expand productivity, I think it works well in the long run. I think there's temporary disturbances, temporary frictions, but I think they resolve themselves in the economy. And I find that the recent AI technologies are interesting because I think they do have a potential to equalize in a way that other technologies didn't. I just think of, somebody sitting in a village in India, and they could be a farmer, they could be a student, and they can actually use some of these things to say, look, how do I do this, that, or the other? And so I think it could actually make the acquisition and the use of knowledge less elite. Certainly, it'll mean that technology can displace people, but in history, it's always been that those people then go and do something else, and they harness those technologies to produce more.
Sagiri, moving back to something you'd mentioned about the care sector, and in Japan, with aging societies, they are facing growing strain. Have you seen anything that could be a good lesson for other economies in Asia that also have rapidly aging populations as well?
Yeah, so from the fiscal side, the biggest challenge comes from how we finance the expenditures for healthcare, public pension, and also we have long-term care services. So, I mean, from Japanese experience, I think it's quite important to embed the automatic adjustment mechanism before we have a huge demographic aging to complete. Japan introduced what's called a macroeconomic slide mechanism in 2004. Which automatically reduces public pension benefits when there's a decline in the working age population and an increase in the life expectancy. So the demographic change is, of course, somewhat predictable, but how exactly the size of the labor force changes or the longevity changes, there's a lot of uncertainty. And then especially after the demographics are already aged, people, there's a large fraction of older people, and it's very difficult to get the support to reform to reduce the benefits. So these preemptive actions are quite important. And then in terms of the healthcare, so Japan has the universal healthcare, and it's been a great success, but at the same time there's a lot of warning. So the universal coverage is very effective, providing access to healthcare for everybody, but the costs have been increasing steadily with the rise in the longevity. So the key lesson from Japan is the importance of the cost containment and also broadening the contribution base. So we need to, it will be basically financed by the taxes on the earnings. So we need to have, the expansion of the workers' earnings base at the same time as the demographic aging and, the rise in longevity continues.
And moving on really to my last question. What would be your advice to policymakers, both from countries with a demographic dividend and those that have chronic aging? What would you advise them to do, or what path to take in the coming years?
Sure. Yeah. For young countries that are still enjoying the demographic dividend, I think it's really important to recognize that this large working age population it's going to be a dividend only if if you have people who are skilled, healthy, and productively employed, and then contribute to the economy. So I guess as Rohini also mentioned, it's quite important and should be the priority of the government to invest heavily in the basic education and also health and women's labor force participation, and also create the enough formal sector jobs so that they can contribute through paying taxes and the social insurance premium. So I think that would be the lesson that I can think of.
In terms of policy, one thing we shouldn't do is not build the welfare state. So I think what the aging societies have done is, they built a very good welfare state. And it's true that welfare state is under fiscal pressure. But I think the response to that is really to think about how to deal with the fiscal pressures. And what Sagiri mentioned about, embedding adjustments in policy is very important, because these are adjustments that politicians find very difficult to make. You can't have elections coming up and then politicians to say, okay, we don't care about the elderly. However, if everybody knows that this is why we're doing things and it will always happen, then it just is not a decision that's being taken. Building welfare states that actually sufficiently provide for those that can't provide for themselves, but then take into account the reality of the fiscal situation. I think that's very important. And one thing I worry about in the case of young economies is that they're poor economies, and they're economies with underdeveloped welfare states. And so I would really hope that what happens is that you say that, look, we take that as given, and then we figure out how to do the financing. And I think that countries that, have grown rich and aged, like Japan and Korea, I think they offer us a lot of lessons. And I just hope we take them.
A cautious optimism then.
Yes, yes.
Well, that sounds like a nice way to round things off for today. So thank you both very much for joining this episode.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean.
And you can learn more about the demographic changes affecting Asia in one of ADBI's new books, Navigating Asia's Path to a High Income and Sustainable Future, available on adbi.org.